In his scientific table, Dr. Hamer has not arranged the SBS according to organs, but for the sake of simplicity according to germ layers. This also makes sense because once you know how one SBS of a germ layer runs, you can almost always deduce the others of the same germ layer, since the SBS of a germ layer run identically for the most part. I will try to illustrate the system behind this in the following video. I'll start with the brainstem control programs. As an explanatory SBS, I take a practical example of the thyroid tissue program. The table of contents at the back leads to the explanatory pages. I will assign it to the possible causes and transfer other SBS of the yellow group to it. Thyroid tissue produces a hormone, thyroxine, which increases our basal metabolic rate. As is so often the case, the conflict of the thyroid tissue can be derived from the biological function alone. It reads, having been too slow to get hold of a morsel for the right side, or having been too slow to get rid of one for the left side. Of course, both sides can also be affected. Now the practical example. I'll start with the one-time process. A 10-year-old girl moves from elementary school to secondary school, a grammar school. In elementary school, she was always the best in her class and only got A's and B's. Now the first math test is coming up at the new school. There are 30 problems to solve. She gets her work back 2 weeks later. She, who has only ever written straight A's, opens her workbook and freezes. She got an F. What she had calculated was correct, but she didn't even complete half of the task in the allotted time. The DHS strikes in the brainstem in the Hamer focus for the thyroid tissue on the right, and the SBS starts. We assume that the DHS was programmed without secondary tracks. There's only the main track, i.e. the conflict itself. The DHS starts the conflict active phase. On the right side, your thyroid cells multiply, resulting in increased thyroxine production. This is also the biological meaning of the program. The increased thyroxine makes her more agile and faster. She now has a better chance of catching the desired chunk, the good grade. The next math test is coming up. The girl is studying harder than usual and is obsessively worried about her grade on the next math test. She gets the work back a week later, opens her exercise book and gets an A. Thank goodness she's got the morsel. She has resolved her conflict with the support of Mother Nature and inevitably enters healing phase A. The previously grown tissue is now broken down with swelling. She feels a thickening, gets a sore throat, and also feels weak and tired. The thickening worries the parents. She goes to the doctor, who takes a tissue sample to rule out cancer and sends it in. The tissue sample shows no cell division, so it is benign. The crisis is inconspicuous. The swelling goes down with it. In healing phase B, the tissue is finally repaired. At the end of the program, the girl has a cavity where the tumor was. As some thyroid tissue is lost with each cycle, she has less than before the SBS. The cavity can fill up with fluid from time to time, which is then called a cyst. It would be a possible way of developing a cyst on the thyroid gland. If the girl had lacked the microbes necessary for the biological process, the tumor would have been encapsulated during the healing phase. If this is discovered after the SBS has expired, it is referred as a benign tumor. And the same applies to almost all other SBS in which the glandular tissue is affected, whether prostate gland, pancreas, etc. Now we take the polycyclic course. The girl writes 3 more Fs during her time at school because she didn't finish her work on time. She gets a recurrence each time, and each time after resolution, the usual symptoms of illness such as swelling of the thyroid, sore throat, etc. The SBS thyroid tissue in this case has expired 3 times more. Therefore, she has lost more thyroid tissue than in the single course. And it would be the same again with the prostate gland, pancreas, etc. Now we come to the hanging healing. Let's assume that the classroom has been programmed into the DHS as a secondary track. Every time the girl enters the classroom, the conflict flares to live. Every time she leaves the classroom, she enters resolution. Over a long period of time, some thyroid tissue is built up and more is lost. Little cell plus, more cell minus. Little cell plus, more cell minus. Little cell plus, more cell minus, etc. What happens to the thyroid tissue? It is becoming less and less and it is melting away. In extreme cases, this can go so far that the tissue is completely broken down. In conventional medicine, this is referred to as an autoimmune disease, and it is said antibodies destroyed the body's own tissue. The logical consequence of the hanging healing is that at some point the thyroid tissue no longer produces enough thyroxine. The girl becomes more sluggish and slower and is diagnosed with hypothyroidism. And the same applies to the prostate gland, pancreas, etc. Think about it for yourself. What happens to the prostate gland in hanging healing? The biological function of the prostate gland is to produce seminal fluid. From this, too, it can be deduced that the conflict must have something to do with reproduction. If the tissue of the prostate gland melts away, the affected person has a hypofunction of the prostate gland, i.e., less ejaculate. What happens with the pancreas in hanging healing? The biological function is the production of digestive juice. From this, too, it can be deduced that the conflict must have something to do with the struggle to digest a morsel. If the tissue there melts away, the affected person has an underactive pancreas, i.e., fewer digestive juices. Now there is still the possibility that the girl does not resolve her conflict. She writes another F in the next paper and remains active in the conflict. Then, of course, the thyroid tissue increases accordingly. It continues to grow. She becomes more and more agile and her basal metabolic rate increases. Now she is diagnosed with hyperthyroidism, and at some point the growth of the tissue becomes noticeable. The parents take her to the doctor and the tissue sample is taken to rule out cancer. The diagnosis is no longer benign as in the first case, but malignant as the cells continue to divide during the active phase of the conflict. You can read about the further procedure here. And the same applies to the prostate gland, pancreas, etc. There is an overfunction of the respective biological function of the organ or it's part of the organ, i.e., more ejaculate, more digestive juice, etc. Finally, I would like to use the example of the thyroid gland to once again point out the misconception that practicing Germanische Heilkunde does not mean sitting down and waiting. Mother Nature will take care of it, may be true as a rule, but sometimes it is not. So let's assume that the girl no longer has enough thyroid tissue to produce the thyroxine she needs due to a hanging healing. What helps the girl? The thyroid tissue does not grow back. So she can only supply synthetic thyroxine from outside, so that the body's processes can continue to run biologically smoothly. But if the girl comes out of the hanging healing and the thyroid tissue can still produce sufficient thyroxine itself, then why does she need synthetic thyroxine? And this can also be transferred to the prostate gland, pancreas, etc. Do you see how logical it was for Dr. Hamer to sort the SBS by germ layers? Sorted by organ. There are countless diagnoses for thyroid tissue alone. Sometimes it is a malignant tumor, sometimes a hyperfunction, cyst, benign encapsulated tumor, hypofunction. But they all have the same cause, namely that the DHS was having been too slow. Only the phase of SBS in which you are caught makes the difference in the diagnosis. Almost all other SBS of the yellow group can be derived from an SBS of the glandular tissue. You don't have to learn organ diseases by heart as you did it in the past, but can understand the SBS logically and simply. The scientific table contains 30 years of research work by Dr. Harmer. It is a blessing for mankind.